snow did not fall so much as settle here, and the way it did made Daenerys think the North possessed a different grammar for winter, a quiet syntax of white upon gray that softened edges without surrendering them. The towers of Winterfell rose like old teeth, their crenellations frosted, the banners stiff with hoarfrost, so that the deerwolves stared out as if carved from the season itself. The yard smelled of damp wool and iron, of horse breath, of ash from the smithy and meat rendered slow in kitchens far within. When she crossed from the great hall into the cold, the air bit the space between her ribs and reminded her that she was made of warmth, and it sharpened the ache that followed her like another shadow. A city burned behind her eyes, a throne that felt farther away each time she took another step north. The Northerners watched. They had the skill of doing it without letting their eyes be caught. And then again, some made a point to be caught, and those were easier to forgive. She was foreign. She carried fire behind her as surely as she wore the heavy white furs over pale silk. The dragons were a rumor overhead when clouds cleared, brief black shapes against the pewter sky. Children ran and slipped and stared. Men set their jaws. Women drew their cloaks close and measured Daenerys with glances that had nothing of court in them. She had learned the weight of being measured. She held her back straight and her chin level and let the cold put color in her face. Jon walked at her side a little too softly for a man whose boots were stained in old roads. He had the habit of lying to the ground with his step, a hunter's craft, a ranger's patience pressed into each heel. He had asked her to see the crypts. He had not asked, not in words. He had said he needed to show her something, and she had nodded, because of the way he held the word need. The way it wore a shape that could not be made of politics. The cold made smoke of their breath. Ghost followed as if mistaken for snow until the red eyes flashed, a pale shadow whose paws made no sound, even on stone. The entrance to the crypts was a mouth in the courtyard wall, unadorned but for frost. The torches guttered as they descended the first steps, and the second, because the air changed down there, and air that had been held by stone for centuries, did not welcome interruption. It merely permitted it. The steps were worn as if countless feet had been patient with them, and the walls had a dampness that collected on knuckles if one brushed them. The silence below was particular. Sound did not travel far. It did not echo. It smothered. It folded itself close and asked for quiet in return. She had been beneath great houses before. Cellars shot with dry wine and salt, vaults where merchants kept their fortune like buried winter, cisterns whose tongues lapped forever. But none of those had the feeling of being among watchers. There were watchers here. Their eyes were stone, but there are kinds of attention that do not require eyes. It mattered to the North that the dead were not simply put away, but kept, remembered with names and faces, guarded by iron swords that lay cold upon their laps. Each statue wore a sternness that would not have fit a Targaryen prince, and Daenerys had known more princes than she liked. These kings of winter were cut with blunt force. They knew cold in a way she had only just begun to learn. "It is different from the places you know," Jon said quietly, as if the statues would overhear if he did not mind his voice. "All places are different until they are not," she said too lightly, and took his arm because the steps dipped and turned, and she would not stumble in front of these stone men. The torch made a gold ring in the air around them. Ghost went ahead and then waited, ears pricked, a flash of tongue to test the damp. They came at last to the line of statues whose names had already begun to slip into the mouth of legend. Bran the Builder had the look of a myth in winter. He was at the far end, and one day, she supposed, a mason had decided that they had gone far enough, and it was time to turn the dead another way. She looked for Lyanna, though she did not intend to say her name. Jon did not say it either, but he stopped before a girl carved with hair loose on her shoulders. The kind of detail a patient sculptor puts on last, a softness seen in hard stone because someone insisted it be there. The iron sword across Lyanna's lap had bloomed with rust at the hilt where hands had palmed it over and over. An old practice, a superstition perhaps, to keep the dead at rest. A small visitor had left a winter rose stone carved, and the frost had made lace of it. Jon did not reach for the statue. His eyes had the stunned, softened look she knew from men who had learned something and not yet learned what to do with it. "I used to come down here as a boy," he said. "I thought ghosts lived in the corners. I knew them all by name before I could read." "Were they comfort or threat?" she asked, her voice softened by the place and not by fear. "Both," he said, and she could believe that. He had been a child with a sword he could not yet lift, a name he could not entirely hold. She reached then and touched the stone of Lyanna's fingers where the blade rested. The cold of it shocked even through her glove. Something like a tremor went through her hand and was gone, no more than a shifting of water in a pitcher when the table is nudged. Yet her mind, treacherous with hope when it ought to be prudent, stepped toward the tremor as if it were a shore. She had been young beside a pyre once, and felt the world peel back above her like the lid of a furnace. She had heard stone shells cry like living things. She had stepped into flame as if returning to a room that had always been hers. Bran says the roots go down into the rock itself. Jon had not looked at her hand. He says the tree doesn't end where we can see it. He says other things, he added with a half smile that did not open. He says many things. The memory of the boy man in the chair in the godswood moved through her. His eyes had the flatness of a pond at dawn, when nothing had yet ruffled it, when every leaf the wind dropped onto it belonged to a story it had already heard. He had looked at her as if reading not the surface, but the shape of the heap beneath. He had said in his thin voice that carried anyway, "Some songs begin under stone. Men forget where they begin them. The old roots listen. The old cold keeps. I do not sing for roots." She had said then, because she was minded to be unkind when looked at like that, and because the red leaves that winter held had whispered even when she stood still, and because everything whispered to her lately, and she did not welcome it. She was tired of being an answer to questions she had not asked. Now in the crypt, Lyanna's statue took her touch and did not give it back, as stone never did. Jon lifted the torch, and the light slid along the iron blade, like a hand along a spine. The names carved at Lyanna's feet were crisp from recent polishing. A place that tended its dead like this would not misplace its memory. "Come," Jon said. "There is something else." He led her farther, past kings whose wolves were so worn the ears had become mere bumps. Ghost paused at a niche half closed by a slab that looked like it had not been moved in a long while. The slab had the dust seal that comes from patience and undisturbance. The wolf nosed at the crack and huffed, then turned to Daenerys as if to say, "Here." Jon set down the torch and put his shoulder to the slab. He did not look at her when he said, "Sam found it in an old account. The queen, one of your line, Alysanne. She came north long ago. He thinks," he pushed, the sinews in his forearm nodding, "he thinks she left something here. An old quarrel," she said, meaning the north and her house, and helped push with her palms flat. The stone moved with a sound like a cough. Dust rose and made their light an orb of cloud. The slab shifted increment by increment, as if reluctant to give even now. The wolf slipped sideways and blew air as if agreeing with the stone's stubbornness. They levered it aside enough to make a dark throat. The smell that came up was dry cold and carried the iron tang of old metal and the sweet spoilage of something that had once been resin. Jon crouched to lift the torch into the narrow. Daenerys bent. She would not have done it for any crypt, but this one that belonged to the man who had followed her into storm. The light showed a chest big enough for a girl to curl into if she were testing whether she could make herself part of wood. The chest had been carved once. Time had eaten the fine lines, but she could see dragons pressed into the lid's grain. One sunk into the other like twisting vines, and along the edges a border that might have been flames before flame forgot it. Jon set the torch in an iron ring and pried at the hasp. It was greased with age, and the grease had become skin. It let go grudgingly. When the lid lifted, the hinges made a sound like a groan someone tried to swallow. She had seen dragon eggs in their cradle. She knew what stone eggs looked like and the ache they carried. The three in that chest were the color of the North's silence. One was dark, almost black. But in the torchlight, it swallowed gold and gave back a deep smoky blue, as if there were a sky pressed inside it. One was pale as frost, with veins so fine she had to lean close to see them. Lines of old silver threading under the white, like the map of a river under ice. One was iron brown, a red drowned into it, flecked with copper that made her think of smithy sparks caught and frozen mid-flight. Her throat closed. There had been a place in Qarth and a night when her hands had trembled, not with fear, but with the kind of hunger that also looks like joy. She had laid stone against flame and prayed to all the names her house had worn for gods, and to all the names fallen from them. She had heard shells crack and the world change shape. She did not reach immediately. Awe can make one clumsy. It can repurpose good intention into sacrilege. Jon did not reach either. Ghost sniffed and backed a pace away, and sneezed in a very small and undignified way. His ears went back and he looked at her with something like embarrassment for having sneezed. "Alysanne," Jon said after a moment. When it became clear that neither of them would speak first, "Sam thinks she gave them to a Stark." An old tale about keeping bonds between houses. There was a winter that bit deeper than most. He found a mention in a letter in a ledger that ought not to have held letters. Daenerys finished softly, and Jon looked at her quickly. She smiled. "Small. He is that kind. He is." She did not know if it was true. She did not care if it was true. The eggs existed, and they were here. Under stone, the North had trusted with its dead. Her hands knew how to be careful. She lifted the dark one first. It was heavier than it looked, and the weight was a promise the way a sleeping animal's warmth is a promise. The shell did not give under her palm. She felt the old smoothness worn into it by nothing, by mere time, by distance. She had the sensation again. The jug of water on a table nudged, and this time it moved through her wrist into the meat of her arm and up, faint and quick, like a small bird testing itself inside its own shell. She closed her eyes. For a moment, the torch and the stone and the names below her feet dropped away. She felt again the furnace of her youth, the way heat can be a room. She heard or remembered or invented the keening that is not a keening but a language older than grief. She opened her eyes on darkness and gold, and the man beside her with the winter wolf's patience. "Fire," Jon said, as if the word had to be offered. "Not only," she answered. Back in the hall, Tyrion waited with his wine and his worry, and the numbers he kept on a private abacus behind his eyes. He made a show of surprise when she spoke of eggs, but only because a show was part of his craft. In truth, he had the look of a man whose misgivings had just been given another face to argue with. He wanted to advise, and she wanted to let him, and yet something about the North made every counsel sound like a door closing. Yora's face, when she allowed him to see what they had found, was a tide coming and going twice. He loved her, and he loved what made her fierce, and the two were not always the same. Grey Worm had no opinion of ancient eggs. He had an inventory of spearheads and of men whose hands were healed enough to hold them. Missandei touched the shell like a word she had not yet translated. The light took her hair and made it burnished. "Dragons hatched once for you," Tyrion said at last, after they had gone away from other ears. "You stood in a fire with a man who had wronged you in the only way he knew how to wrong the world. Blood and treason and pyre and salt. You do not have that now. You are not that girl now." "I have old cold," she said, "and something that listens under stone. And I have my own blood. It has never failed me for being less than a pyre." He studied her face. "There are other fires," Tyrion said. "There is the heat that lives in the breath of a house with all its doors shut for winter. There is forge heat. There is the heat of a beast sleeping. You do not like to be told to be careful, so I will not. But I will say, if you bend any of those to your purpose, bend them with a gentle hand." "And I am not gentle," she said. And then, after a beat, "Because the North taught honesty as if it were a virtue. But I can be precise. The gods' wood had its own breath, even in cold, even with snow pinned down by its own weight. There was a dampness that had learned stillness, the way a singer learns a scale. The heart tree stood there like an old judge and bled its red in thin, varnished lines. Bran had wheeled himself there without sound. His cheeks had the pale of someone who eats, because someone tells him he must. His gaze was not a boy's gaze. He regarded the egg in her arms. "You brought it out of the dark," he said mildly. "It was not light down there," she answered. "It is not light up here," Bran said, and the corner of her mouth almost moved. "You want to make something that is both," he added. "There are old songs about that. You keep speaking of songs. I do not sing." "Then listen," he said, with no malice in it. She set the egg on the roots where they broke the ground like ribs. She felt a shiver not of cold, but of anticipation. Above them, the sky held to its iron, and did not yet loose snow. The leaves clicked delicately when the wind threaded them. She waited with the patience she had grown like a scar. When the cold reached her fingers past the glove, she lifted the egg again and let the god's wood keep its old work. Bran's eyes traced the air in a way she could not follow. The tree's face carved there by someone long dead had a trick of looking right when one was wrong and wrong when one was right. She had no gods for it. She had only respect. That night, in her chamber where the fire was permitted to be immoderate, Daenerys laid the 3 eggs on a table of dark wood. The wood had come from a tree that had grown somewhere warmer. It knew a different story of flame. She set the dark egg at the center. She touched each one in turn and left her hand until the cold bit and the skin beneath her glove tried to flinch. She did not flinch. She listened. The fire in the hearth popped. Cloth settled. Somewhere in the keep, a door fell to, and the stone took the sound and folded it away. She had a knife. It had been built for eating and for a queen's caution. She set the blade's tip to her finger and pricked. The pain was as small as a cough. Blood welled, bright, undeniable. She let a drop fall on the dark shell, and another on the pale, and another on the iron brown. Blood dried quickly in winter, but it did not, before it dried, refuse to be itself. She thought of Niri Maz-Dur, and thought of how there are names one should say in order to remember what not to do. She thought of the pyre and the sensation of the world unbuttoning like a cloak. It was not fire alone, or else the North would not have watched her as it did, and the old thing under Winterfell would not have greeted her the way a house sometimes greets a stranger who is about to become a guest. She wrapped the dark egg in a pelt and carried it through corridors where the torches made islands of light, and the cold slipped like a cat from shadow to shadow. She did not wake any maid. She did not bring any guard. Ghost met her at the turn that led to the crypts and regarded her gravely, and then trotted ahead as if he had expected her. It took a kind of humility to follow a wolf. The descent tasted of old breath held too long. The torch she stole from the wall spat and hissed, and then settled, and took its duties seriously. She did not go to Lyanna's statue first. She went farther, past lines of stone that felt like the forest one crosses at dusk, when the path will not be found again if you look away. She found the niche they had opened. She did not place the dark egg back into the chest. She held it and turned, and went instead to a place where the wall made a shallow angle. The stone there was colder than elsewhere. She felt it with her palm and thought of the way some doors do not look like doors. If this is folly, she said quietly into the quiet, "It is mine." If there are gods that listen under stone, they do not require the courtesies of loud prayer. She set the egg on the paving and built around it the only fire she could drag down there without making a herald of smoke. Braziers scavenged from unused corners, wicks soaked in oil she had pressed from the kitchens into goatskin, small logs stolen from the pile and wrapped in sacking. She did not set one conflagration. She set 3 small obedient heats, equidistant, the way one arranges candles around a bed to keep a fevered child watched. The air thickened with a sweetness that came from the oil and a bite that came from iron meeting flame. She spoke to it, the way one speaks to a restless horse. Not words that meant anything beyond the meaning given by a human tongue being soft. High Valyrian has lullabies, and she had learned them in rooms that had none to sing them to her. She gave those to the stone. Between one verse and the next, She bared her wrist and set it briefly over the nearest brazier until the skin said enough. She pressed that heat to the shell. Heat must come from a body for the body to be convinced it is called. She did the same with the others, and then lowered her arm and waited. A sigh moved through the crypt. It came along the floor first, a swelling that was not air and not wind. A subtle change in the way the light moved. The torches leaned and then stood steady. A drop of water fell from somewhere unseen and clicked on stone, and its sound traveled too far, as if the crypt had decided it deserved more attention than it ought to. Something beyond the wall gave a settling groan, an old beam or an old root shifting where it was braced. Daenerys did not move. Ghost lay down. His head went low, and his eyes did not blink. She was not looking at the egg when she felt the second tremor move up through her own bones. She had no words for it. She looked then, and saw no change and waited, and saw none, and waited. Hours are different in the dark. They collect in the lap and spill over the knees and leave behind their weight even when they are gone. She warmed her fingers again and again and pressed them again to the shell, and sang without any think of who listened. Midnight has a temperature if one knows how to feel it. There was a shift when that hour came, and it was small and precise. The eggshell's sheen changed. Not its color. Something in its surface accepted a different light and gave it back altered. The black, not black of it took the torch glow and sent it out in threads she would not have called blue, but something that wanted to be named blue. She did not startle. She bent and laid her ear to it. Her own breath made sound. Beneath that, the noise she sought came very soft. A sound like the first breath taken by a bellows when a smith put his foot to it and pressed half a measure. It had been this way and not this way before. Heat had roared in her then and made the world an assault. Now the cold around the small fire collected itself like a ring of elders and listened, and the heat was a gentle thing put in her hands like a child by a mother who had decided to trust her after all. She pressed her forehead to the shell and closed her eyes, and the years between this and the time in the red waste fell away and did not matter. "Come," she whispered, without words. "Come out of stone. Come to me." The crack, when it came, was small. It ran like a single silver hair under a black surface. Then another. There was the tiny sound of a thing that should not make sound and yet does. Egg tooth, that little white jewel nature bestows upon the unready and takes away when it has done its work. She sat back, her hands lifted instinctively, not to catch. One does not catch a hatching, but to receive. Ghost raised his head and his ears moved forward, and he made a low noise that had no name. A sliver of shell lifted. The air released something it had been holding for centuries. Not magic. She had no patience for men who named things so, and thought the naming the same as understanding. But the release a room feels when a long-kept secret is told at last to a listener who will not betray it. Steam rose and made ribbons in the torchlight. A smell came with it. The smell that lives in caves where beasts winter. Animal and new and old and clean. The creature that forced itself into the world was not born of flame, or not only. Its scales were dark where the shell had been dark, and yet along the edges of each small plate ran a pale tracer, as if a fine brush had drawn frost on lacquer. Its eyes opened before it had even cleared its shoulders, and they were not red or gold. They were a pale gray blue, and they found her narrowed and widened, trying the world. It sneezed. Ridiculous. The breath it made fogged the air and drifted like the lightest snow. It made a sound that was all throat and all demand. She did not reach first. She let it seek. It turned toward heat the way all living things do at the start. One of the braziers warmed its face, and it hissed at it as if the brazier had mocked it. Then it turned and found the heartbeat that had been the shape beneath song, and that was her. She put out her hand and it climbed, because that is what dragons do when offered height and warmth. Its feet were needles. Her skin took them and welcomed the pain and stored it. It clung and steadied its head against the cup of her palm. The membrane of its wing unfolded and folded again, as if embarrassed to have displayed itself without instruction. She did not give it a name. Names are covenants, and should be given in daylight, after witnesses have eaten and spoken and agreed to be bound. Have patience, she told the part of herself that burned toward possession. She had been a girl with 3 hot answers once. She would be a woman with 1 careful answer now. She bent and breathed it in. The smell of damp coal, of iron when it is first made hot, of winter rooms when the door opens, and someone has come from outside and brings the weather with him like a cloak he is not ready to shed. The sound from the stone behind the wall came again, and this time it was not a groan. It was the slow scrape of something very old twisting in its sleep. Beyond the few feet of crypt where her light reached, beyond the shadow where names lived on their slabs, beyond the patience of iron swords rusting, she felt, not with any sense she could name, the roots that Bran had spoken of, moving, or not moving, or simply attending. This had woken more than a beast. Under Winterfell, beneath watchful stone, a chord had been struck, and the rock held the note and began to sing it back. The dragonling clambered up her arm as if her shoulder were a crag. It paused at her throat and tasted the air there. Its tongue was quick and its breath cool against her warmth. It found the line of the blood that had dried on her skin and churred and licked it and made a face at the iron taste. She laughed then aloud, and the sound did not offend the dead. It placed both forefeet against her jaw as if to balance itself, and its wing juddered and opened, a pale edge flashing in the gloom like a knife's laugh. She thought of Tyrion's careful words, of Missandei's fingers on scales, of Jorah standing just far enough away to be wounded by wishing. She thought of Jon, who had walked with her down into the stone and stood beside her before the girl who was his mother and had not moved to take or to forbid. He deserved. She thought suddenly and fiercely, to be allowed to see something be born without it being taken from him. She tucked the small body closer against her neck, where it found the hollow below her ear and pressed itself there with the blind certainty of the new. Come then. She said softly to Ghost, and the wolf rose and moved with her as she gathered the brazier's flame with her breath and her patience, and then left the coals to die where the stone would keep them from making a mischief. She lifted the egg with the hair-thin crack that had not yet become a gap. 1 life at a time, she told herself, and felt the old hunger turn its face toward discipline like a horse toward a rein. She should leave the other 2 in the chest, for now. Even joy benefits from rationing. She was learning the art of leaving stones unturned until the world is ready for what lies beneath them. In the corridor, the light from the torches she had not disturbed licked the edges of the gloom and then retreated. Her breath plumed, and the dragonlings did too, making brief ghosts that fled them. She had the impulse to hide it under her cloak like a thief with a prize, but that was habit born of a life spent with no one to give witness. Now here, even if the North thought her sorcery, she had done this with the permission of its stone. She did not need to hide from rock and old names. Jon was there at the mouth of the corridor, because the world is sometimes kind enough to put a man where you are already turning to tell him something. His face carried the candlelight from the wall bracket. It made of his features a series of planes that looked carved. He saw her, the cloak, the set of her arm. It took him a heartbeat to understand. When he did, his eyes changed in a way that put something in her throat. He came forward not with hands outstretched to take, but with the carefulness one uses in an aviary when a bright bird has elected to land where it will. Ghost sniffed, and sat, and sneezed again. The small dragon lifted its head, eyes like winter sky narrowing again, then opening, then fixing. Jon stopped at a distance a gentle thing would require. He did not ask a question. His mouth made an O despite himself, and then he shut it again. And then, boyish, it opened despite his will, and she had a future's worth of tenderness for that. It lives, he said unnecessarily. What he meant was, something lives in a place where we keep our dead, and we are not undone by it. It lives, she said. The echo did not punish them. A sound perhaps no one else would have heard came from the far end of the crypt and ran along the stone like water spills along a shallow channel. A narrow note, the sound of a thin shell, protesting an internal insistence. Daenerys turned her head as much as she could without displacing the warm weight against her neck. Jon's eyes went past her and widened again, not in fear, not exactly. He looked back to her, and there was question in it this time. How many? How far? How fast? We will not rush it, she said, and she did not know if she meant the hatching or the war or the claim she intended to make of the world, and perhaps it did not matter. Come, help me bring this one to light. They climbed the steps together. The cold thinned as they rose and took on a friendlier shape. At the top, the yard held its hush like a bowl and did not spill. The sky threatened snow and relented. There were men at the gate standing with their hands cuffed together against the biting air. A stable boy hurried a frost-stiff broom along. Somewhere far within the keep, a bell marked an hour. No one looked up, and if they had, they would have seen a queen with her cloak held close at her throat, and thought her no different from any night she slept, a little less. In her chamber, she made of the bed a nest without meaning to. Furs flung wide, coals urged to a temper that would not scald, basins of snowmelt that a maid had left for her night water. The little beast explored with the solemnity that belongs only to the new and to the very old. It put a foot in the water and drew it back, offended and fascinated. It discovered the softness of fur, and kneaded it as if testing a hill of snow. It sneezed again, and seemed as surprised by that as the first time. When it finally yawned, the mouth it made was lined in delicate thorn. Jon stood with his hands behind his back as if his fingers could not be trusted. He came closer when she nodded. He set his knuckle out. The dragonling sniffed, found nothing that had interested it, and turned with the imperiousness of a prince before it learns names. Jon huffed laughter, and the warmth of it made a ghost cloud. I have seen a great many impossible things, he said, but this is the first one to sneeze on me. It will sneeze on kings and beggars alike. She said, It is a Democrat, Jon Snow. He glanced at her then, the way a man does when he hears his name and finds it still fits. There were other names in him now, uncoiling, but she would not take those from him with her mouth. Outside, wind went like a hand across a harp. She sat, and the creature settled where her thigh met her hip, as if it had been waiting all its short life for that shaped warmth. She studied its scales in the firelight. She counted the breath. She let the weight of what she had done unfold its edges inside her, not to frighten her but to fill her. It had been easy once to be a vessel for a fire that asked for no permission. Now she would be a vessel for a song that wanted both ice and flame to carry it. Tyrion, when told, made the face of a man who had correctly guessed the next number in a sequence, and wished he had not. He asked her for practicalities, and she gave them as far as they mattered. Oil, braziers, patience, blood. She did not describe the listening stone. Some things are not weakened by being spoken, but they are not helped by it either. You have made a promise to the north without asking it, he said, turning his cup in his hand so that the wine made a thin river at its rim. You have made life under their dead. Your enemies will call this sorcery. Some of your friends will too. They may call it what they like. She said, They can learn the name later. Names, Tyrion said mildly, are powerful. But in the meantime, perhaps keep your hatchlings out of sight of those who have soothed themselves with talk of crypts being safe places. Yumnani. She thought of iron swords across stone laps. Crypts are not safe in a world where the dead walk at others' call. She said, We will make them safer. If what comes comes here, and I think it will, I would rather meet it with old names watching me, and a new voice on my shoulder, than with the memory of all the dead who could not lift their stone eyelids. And see, that is not an answer calculated to make men sleep easier, Tyrion said. But he did not try to dissuade her. He had learned which parts of her could be moved, and which must be met. Word spread as word does in a keep, even when no one speaks it aloud. A stable girl with ash on her hands saw gray smoke breathe where no ember lived. A baker's boy with his cheek flour-dusted tasted the air, and found it tasting of iron and newness as if the day had turned and was starting again at dawn. The old woman who tended the candles in the small sept winked at Daenerys in the courtyard and let her wax drip in a perfect circle, a prayer for keeping. Sansa's eyes were blades when they met Daenerys, and then not blades, and then she looked at Jon, and then at the sky, and if she did not like it, she was clever enough to put dislike aside until it could be used. Arya found her not because anyone told her where to look, but because doors that are slightly ajar are an invitation to those who have learned which doors to trust. She stood in the threshold of the chamber, like a shadow caught, and decided not to flee. Her face was not easy to read until she smiled, and even then it was like dawn under cloud, subtle, choosing which things to illuminate and which to leave. The little dragon raised its head and froze, and then performed a slow, ridiculous attempt at looking larger. Arya lifted her hand and did not reach. "Does it bite?" she asked, in a tone that implied she would not mind. "It is barely a mouth," Daenerys said. "But yes, I imagine it will bite everything, including its own tail. Soon, it will learn it is attached to it." "Like men," Arya said, and came closer, and the dragon tasted the air near her and sneezed, and Arya laughed, quick and full, a sound that made even the fire take notice. "Sansa will not like it," she added cheerfully. "She does not like surprises she hasn't ordered." "I am no surprise," Daenerys said, and then thought of her life, and amended, "I am perhaps too many surprises." Arya tilted her head. "He calls you Dany. When he says it, it sounds like something he remembered rather than learned," she said, and then shrugged off the astonishment at her own mouth, saying that aloud. "Keep it alive, whatever it is that comes here. It will not mind whether you raised a wolf or a dragon or a fieldstone. It will break them all. Make it hard." "I intend to," Daenerys said, simple as a door shutting properly. Night made the keep a hive of breath, each chamber its own pool of warmth. Snow held off, because stories prefer a pause before a fall. She returned twice to the chest with the other eggs and once to the crypt without any egg at all, to stand in the same circle of pavers and listen. The song grown in the stone did not fade. It changed key, very slightly, as if the rock itself had decided to harmonize with the creature that had added its voice to the world, and would not be unmade if the song fell quiet. The second egg answered in its own hour, and she was there with a basin of melted snow to pour over the shell between heat. Because ice is not merely absence, and because the North had taught her by example that what is cold is not lifeless, and because Bran's strange words had taken root in her despite herself. The shell took the chill, and then the hand heat, and then the oil, and then her breath, and then her blood. Only a drop, and then it cracked with the sound of a thread breaking. The creature inside was the color of old iron and honey, and its eye had a fleck in it like a star seen at dawn. She did not sleep much, but she was not exhausted. There is a kind of wakefulness the body loves, because it means its oldest work is being done. When she closed her eyes, she saw not a throne but scales laid one over another, in an order that made sense to someone older than kings. When she opened them, she watched small feet learn the shape of her hand, and the edge of her cloak, and the boundary at which the fire was friend and not foe. The third egg remained stone. There's meaning in that. She did not treat it as failure. She set it on the bench where the dawn might find it, and she sang to it, because a thing does not change its nature, simply because it is late. Jon looked at it, and then at her, and reached out, and then drew his hand back, and then, at her nod, touched the shell with the back of his fingers. "You do not hammer the last nail first," he said, and she understood him perhaps more clearly than he knew. Outside, the ravens had wait in the trees. The wind carried a rumor with it from the north, the rumor of boots and the dragging feet of things that marched without wanting to. The men on the walls learned to keep their eyes on the far white rather than the near comfort of watching a court in the yard. They measured how long it took a cloud bank to gather at the horizon and how fast it moved. The keep breathed, the way a body braces before lifting. Daenerys stood in the yard at noon, and the light slid over her, as if it had been told to take care. She held neither of the hatchlings then, because there's a difference between being a house of warmth and making of that warmth a banner. She let them sleep in a cradle of fur where the fire's heat and the chamber's cold shook hands and made a pact. She walked with Jon to the smithy where Gendry Baratheon bent iron to what had been asked of it. Sparks leapt and died. Men straightened when she entered, and then bent again, because work is an easier friend than awe. "Steel," Gendry said, wiping his forearm without stopping his motion. "Dragon glass. I don't much care which if it's sharp. Tell your beasts." He flicked a look up, as if they might be perched on a lintel, not to frighten the girls. Or do. Fright can be useful. They're small, she said. They will be for a while. Men will not feel small near them. That can be useful too. Not if you want them to listen, Jon said, and she nodded. She was learning which of her truths needed soft speech to survive in a country that had not asked for them. The dusk that day came with a gray, the color of wet wool. The first snow in 3 days put a skin on the yard, thin as cream. Daenerys took the third egg in her hands, and it was heavy, and no warmer than the stone around it. She did not argue with it. She walked once more down to the crypt, alone, and the sound the torches made when they noticed her was small and glad. She stood before Lyanna again, and allowed herself the insolence of speaking to a statue, as if it could alter anything. "You hid what was given to you," she said. "You were a secret, and you kept secrets. I do not know if they were good secrets. I have had bad ones. I have carried names that did not fit, and names that fit too well. I will not hide what was given to me. I will keep it. That is different. It is the best I can do." Nemso. Her breath made a patch of pale before the girl's stone face, and then was gone. She set the egg on the tomb's edge like an offering, and if that was irreverent, the North could forgive her or not. The little wound on her finger had closed. She bit it open again, and let a drop fall onto the pale veins under the shell, and watched it slide and hold, and then be drunk in by a surface that ought not to be able to drink. It was as if the stone had decided to be less stone for a moment, as a courtesy to the blood that had asked. No crack came. No sigh. She did not ask. She lifted the egg and carried it to the place where the wall made its odd angle, and set it down and lit no braziers this time. The cold put its hand over hers and she took it, and then withdrew. On the step above, she turned and looked back. Not to ask again, but to witness. If patience were a person, it would have sat at her shoulder and nodded. The hatchlings slept twined together when she returned. One dreamed, and its feet worked, and the membrane of its wings quivered, as if catching wind in the dark. She eased her body onto the bed and lay without sleep, and without exhaustion, and counted heartbeats, and found them steady. Near dawn, when the sky had the pallor of a boy who has stayed awake to see what men do at night, she rose and went once more below. The crypt held its temperature the way a miser holds coin. Her breath plumed. The torch licked the walls and the eyes of kings did not alter. At the bend in the passage, she stopped because she had not brought any great expectation with her, and yet she saw the smallness of what she had not expected. A line as thin as a hair dividing the pale shell across one side, delicate and complete as if an artist had laid it with a needle, dipped in a metal no one could name. She bent. She put her ear to the shell. The sound within was there. It was not eager. It was not reluctant. It was the sound of timing being decided. She could have insisted. She did not. She lifted the egg, and it lay in her hands like an old secret that had ceased to be a secret the moment it was agreed to be one. On the step above, something else changed. She felt it before she heard it. The way the stone under your foot says someone else has put their weight upon it. She turned, and there was no one there. Then Bran spoke from the farther dark and came forward, pushed by the big stable boy Hodor had once been, and now was not, and never would be again. She did not notice the boy who pushed the chair. She noticed the way Bran's eyes held both their own sight and something that had borrowed them for a while. "You have made the sound," he said mildly. "It will make another in answer. You will have to decide which sound is yours and which belongs to what lives under your feet. I know what belongs to me." She said, and though it was pride, it was also true. "You know some of it," Bran said, which was also true. The stillness in the crypt, thickened for a heartbeat as if to agree, and then relented. "They like you," he added, unhelpfully and helpfully at once. "Who?" "Roots," he said, and looked amused briefly. "Names. The parts of the world that cannot be made in a forge, and perhaps the parts that can. I do not court the land," she said. "I ask it to attend while I do what must be done." "It is attending," Bran said, and that was enough. When she set the third egg back upon fur and warmth and discipline of small fire and patient cold, it did not crack. She did not begrudge it the hours it took to decide that she was not merely a woman with a need, but a woman with a promise. When, at last, there came the finest noise, finer even than silk torn by a careless ring, she smiled without showing her teeth and did not hurry. And because she did not hurry, the line widened at a pace suited to those who have waited long enough that they are not required to prove impatience. The creature inside showed itself first with a tongue as pale as ice, and then with a muzzle, the color of moon-dark water, and then with eyes that opened like a coin showing its face. She did not name them. Not yet. She had named cities inside herself and burned them when they betrayed her. She had named mountains and crossed them and found them smaller than her will. She would not name these until the North had had its say, and the long white thing beyond it had tried and failed to unmake them. When the horn sounded from the walls at midday, one long note, not alarm. Not alarm, but the practice of alarm. Men move toward their places with the comfortable speed of those who have made a chore of fearing and will not let the fear run ahead of the work. Snow came at last with a mind of its own and put itself on everything that did not move. Daenerys wrapped herself, and her warmth smelled of dragons, and of her own skin, and of a new iron she had forged under stone. The hatchlings slept and woke and sneezed and reached and learned the boundary of teeth against a queen's fingers. Jon stood at the window with his shoulder to the stone and watched the horizon as if it would do him the courtesy of announcing itself with banners. "Will you take them below when it is time?" he asked without turning. "I will take them wherever the song carries them," she said. And the answer surprised her by being true in the way that does not admit argument. "Under stone, over stone, through fire, in snow, wherever the North asks me to keep my word." "And the South?" he asked at last, turning, his face set at its angles, his mouth a thought about to be spoken. "The South," she said, thinking of steps and corridors and chairs built to require genuflection. "Will learn to listen to what was born under the North's silence." He came across the room and stopped just near enough that the heat from his body found the deep of her elbow where the blood ran close. He reached without looking, and his fingers found a small scale-like disc. The little dragon had shed, and he held it in his palm and studied it as if it were a coin whose mint he did not know. "You want to be loved," he said quietly, not unkindly. "I want to be obeyed." Honest, because the North rewarded honesty with respect more often than the South did. Then, after a heartbeat, "And I want what I make to be good." "Make it so," he said, which was both blessing and impossible instruction. She lifted the smallest of the three, the pale-edged one, and set it into the cradle of his hands. It settled, as if it had returned to its own nest. Jon looked down, and for the length of a man drawing one breath, and letting the next find him, he smiled without sorrow. The snow fell. The North listened. Under Winterfell, the old song continued, now with a new line sung across it, high and fine, the cry of a creature that had once been stone, and now was not. And when the night came on soft feet and lay its weight over the roofs, the crypt took it in, and the iron on the laps of old kings darkened, and the woman who had once stepped into fire laid her hand on a warmth she had made in a place that had never promised her any. The dead did not stir. Not yet. The living breathed together. Somewhere out in the white, something that had mistaken stillness for its advantage raised its head and listened as well, and found that the sound it heard did not belong to it. It waited anyway. Some enemies are patient, and some queens learn patience enough to meet them. Ka. The days learned her shape, as if the keep itself had begun to make a place where she fit. Morning came thin and blue, and slid along the stone. Evening laid its hand heavier and asked questions with the creak of wood and the muffled cough of a brazier settling. Within those measures, Daenerys learned the weight of the hatchlings and the way they asked to be held. Not with voices but by how they put their talons into her sleeve. By the small, impatient blows of their wings that were barely wings yet. They ate with the solemn fury of all young things. Bat mutton cut small. Slivers of hair. Once the char of a mouse taken from a trap in a corridor. There had been laughter over that in the kitchen and a stern look layered over it, by a steward who knew how far Winterfell's larder had to go and did not relish the queen making pets of its pests. The meat warmed, the grease wiped, the little mouths eager, and then reluctant, and then finally satisfied, falling asleep where they had finished with the innocence that never lasts. She did not keep them in her arms always. They must learn that her warmth was a gift, not a given. She set them in a nest of fur and wool, near but not too near the hearth, and drafted the heat back when it grew indulgent. She walked the yard and felt eyes tip against her like flakes of snow. The men who had watched dragons wheeling high above, now watched 3 slivers of an old story, and measured them against the hunger that would come with winter truly arrived. Minds made ledgers of wonder and worry with quick, quiet chalk. Sansa came to her chamber and did not sit at once. She walked to the window and drew a finger along the frost rim, where cold insinuated itself between lead and glass. Her hair took the fire like a held flame. She did not look at the nest until she had arranged herself to. Then she did, and her mouth softened in a way it almost never did in public. A girl lived in that mouth for an instant, and then learned again to be a lady, because life had taught her to respect rooms and their dangers. They are smaller than I expected, she said. And it was not unkind. They will not be for long, Daenerys said, if I feed them as they ask. Sansa's eyes flicked from the sleeping coil of scales to Daenerys' face and then back. And will you? I will feed them as the North allows, Daenerys answered, which was both courtesy and shrewdness. I do not intend to strip your flocks to make my future easier. We have not enough for ourselves as it is, Sansa said matter of fact. The way one recites numbers one has counted twice. What White Harbor sends comes slow, and the roads are not roads after the first good fall. Lord Manderley does what he can, but the sea answers to no banner, and ships do not come when waves make their own orders. I will ask no more than you can give without unmaking yourselves, Daenerys said. You may have to ask more than that, Sansa returned, but the edge in it was not aimed to cut. It was for keeping both of them awake. When the dead come, the living are poor. Be certain your gifts cost what you believe they cost, not an old story's price. I know the price of old stories, Daenerys said, and Sansa's mouth moved at that, whether in pity or acknowledgement or fear. Daenerys could not tell. After Sansa left, Tyrion took her chair as if the wood knew his weight, and he had been the curve it learned to expect. He had wine because he always did, and because winter asked for warmth men could swallow. He did not reach toward the nest. He held his cup in both hands as if it were a book he might read something unexpected from if he were patient. If you mean to keep them from the yard, he said, we will have to train the keep to believe in secrets again. There is no keeping this secret, Daenerys said. Even if no eyes had seen them, every dog in Winterfell would tell the others in its sleep. The stone would tell roots. Old women would know with their hands. Yes. Then you will show them? Tyrion asked, and his eyes were bright with the pleasure of tracing a course through a field with no map, and finding his feet steady anyway. In measure, she said. I do not mean to hand my enemies their banners, but neither do I intend to make my friends feel as if I am keeping a knife under my skirts. Wise, Tyrion said. We will pretend this was my idea if it goes poorly. Grey Worm stood in the doorway once, not entering until she nodded. He had the air of a man deployed in a city street, where the windows are all dark, and one knows someone can see anyway. He looked at the sleeping curve, then at her. His face did not change, but his eyes learned something and set it aside. We will post men, he said. Not many. Men who do not speak when they do not need to. Post women, too, she said, and he nodded at once. He had learned that there are offices men will not fill as deftly as women, and this was one, Women have better ears when rooms think they are empty. Missandei knelt and touched where a small scale had loosened. Her fingers moved with reverence that had nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with precision. Do they accept High Valyrian? She asked with a smile that warmed the room because it was not for anyone but Daenerys. They accept tone, Daenerys said. They accept hand. They will accept words when mouths have made enough meals for them. They liked a lullaby more than a command. I will sing if you like, Missandei said. And Daenerys nearly said, I always like when you sing, and did not, because that belonged elsewhere, and winter does not forgive everything said in warmth. In the God's Wood, the heart tree made of its face a test, and the snow gathered along its roots, and did not melt because nothing in that grove melted, because the North had decided this was the place where it would keep certain things cold. Bran sat with a blanket over his knees, and let the blanket slide without embarrassment when the edge fell. His eyes were milk at the edges and water at the middle, and behind both something that had neither milk nor water in its name. They dream when they sleep, he said as Daenerys stood beside him. Hands warmed on the sides of a clay cup, a kitchen girl had pressed on her with an authority that brooked no refusal. Some creatures do not. These do. They dream of heat. They dream of wind. They dream of teeth. They do not dream of the sea. How can you know that? Daenerys asked and then shook her head. She knew better than to ask him how he knew anything. If you know what they dream, can you make them dream peace? I could, he said. That would be a mistake. Peace is for the old. Give them hunger. Give them wind. Ask the gods that are not gods for kindness later. Entro. You speak of gods, she said gently, as if they were peers you sometimes tolerate. They are not peers, Bran said. And they are not gods. They are old parts of the world, and men put faces on them when they get lonely. She found him not cruel, which was a cruelty to the kind of hope that wants to find boys where the world has made something else. She felt the tree watching with the kind of attention that belongs to a spy who is also a grandparent, taken up with pride for a thing it will report without remorse. Jon sought her in the hours before the sun admitted it had to attempt to rise. He had a sheen on his skin from the cold that made it seem as if he had been carved from what lay outside and rubbed until the warmth of his blood came through the polish. He brought no words first. He sat with her near the banked fire and watched a hatchling make a serious attempt at walking the length of her forearm and misjudge the step to her wrist and tumble and right itself with a wounded dignity. When I was a boy, he said at last, I wanted a pup of my own. I had Ghost, and I wanted more, because children are greedy for what they love. My father. He paused, and the word father made a different shape in him now, whether or not he let that show every time it did so. He said, you do not ask a house to feed two great bellies out of one trencher. You teach the one you have to hunt. You are not a boy. Namts. I am not, she agreed. And these will not hunt until there is no other choice. I will teach them to hunt when the world demands we be less gentle than we prefer. His mouth tilted. You have a preference for gentleness? For precision? She said. But in a world made by men, it sometimes looks like gentleness until it is not. He took that in and looked at his hands and turned his palms up, as if asking them to confess what they had done. They had done too much. He lifted one and held it out, and she inclined her forearm, and the hatchling stepped as if embarking upon a bridge that might fall if he insulted it by trusting it too quickly. It reached the island of his palm and stood and blinked, and then made a little sound that belonged to creatures that have no right to sound like laughter, and yet do. Jon breathed out, and his breath made a small cloud that hung, and then was gone. You will not take them into battle, he said. Not this winter. They will take themselves into battle if I do not keep them near my chest, she said, honest for him as she had learned to be. We will fight the dead with dragonglass and flame and men who do not tremble when they ought to. These are not weapons. Not yet. They are the first line of a story that will make more lines once we are done with the first. He nodded. We will have to hold the first line, he said. The horn from the wall used the noon light to travel farther than it would have in dawn's blue. One note. Long. held so that all the towers of Winterfell could listen and agree on what they had heard. Men set down bowls. Women set down wool. "It was only practice," shouted the man near the gate. "It was only forming the habit of fear so it could be used, and not waste itself." But practice is a cousin to the thing itself, and hearts lifted and dropped. The blood took instruction and remembered. Gendry's strikes at the forge made a rhythm that yoked itself to the way Daenerys' breath moved when she worked the hatchlings through their small lessons. "Soves," she said softly, and the Dark One folded itself and made sleep truly instead of feigning it to see what she would do. "Sickies," and the Iron Red lifted itself and balanced with admirable seriousness on the basket hilts she had brought from the smith to test their claws without building bad habits against flesh. Dracarys she did not say until the night when Missandei had her dotted linen wrapped high for warmth, and Jon removed his gloves without appearing to do so, and Bran had retired, and Arya watched from the shadows with the kind of avidity one finds in hawks. She made the word small and offered it as if it were something to be sniffed first. A breath came from the Dark One that was not fire and not only air. It was a heat like an oven's when the door is opened at last, a rush with a soft edge to it. The coal she had nursed brightened almost imperceptibly. The Iron Red sneezed and produced a smoke thread that drifted as if waiting to see whether it ought to become something else. The pale-edged hatchling merely blinked and licked its own needle foot and put that foot sternly back down as if to say, "Now is not the time. You will be patient for them," she said aloud, as much to herself as to the room. Jon's knuckles were pale with the work of not making fists out of a hunger he did not allow. Arya let out a breath that had been storing itself and smiled with her teeth. "Good," she said. "If you find yourself a blade that does everything well on the first day, throw it away. It will betray you by the third. Winter remakes men into students, whether they intend to learn. The lords who had come and would not sit at the same table, because a slur made in a year when they were thin has more weight than they allowed for when they were fed, sat at the same table anyway, because the dead have a way of joining men that living grievance never will." Bronze Jon Royce kept his back square and comfortable. His coat had runes of old pride stitched into its seam. Lyanna Mormont glared at a man 3 times her size until he found somewhere else to put his eyes. Davos Seaworth took off his gloves and arranged them, a man who had learned to use his hands as eyes. Varys moved like a thought no one confessed to thinking, and then said something that made men believe they had arrived at it themselves. "Word from the last hearth," Davos said, setting a parchment down with distaste for the medium rather than the message. "Lord Umber begged for wagons for the children to bring to us. He'll bring men on horseback. The ravens that left after this one will not arrive. They will have been kept, or eaten." "Eaten by what?" A northern voice, hard with the need to reject the worst possible answer, asked. "By crows," Davos said gently, "and by whatever walks behind them and has no business walking. We'll have them here within 2 days if the boy rides as fast as I think he will. We will keep this keep full, my lady," he added to Sansa. "Crowded rooms make heat. Hungry rooms make anger. We'll keep heat and curb anger if you'll have my advice to hand." "Bender." "We will have it," Sansa said, and Daenerys saw that the girl who had once believed in fine sleeves had learned the beauty of a man who speaks plainly. Tyrion traced the map with 2 fingers and did not look up when he spoke. "The trenches can be dug and filled with oil. If only we had a creature to alight and pour flame into them at a word." He lifted his eyes, amused without wanting to be cruel, and Daenerys shook her head. "Not yet," his look told her. "Not yet," she returned. "They will not enjoy flame," Varys murmured, "but they will not fear it." "Then we will give them something to fear," Jon said. "We will give them men who stand. We will give them iron that does not flee when struck. We will give them the North's stubbornness and the South's pride, for once in a marriage that might produce a child worth the trouble it caused." "Bold," Tyrion said. "Now all we require are 3,000 more of you, and perhaps a dragon with better manners." After the council, in the corridor where tapestries hung heavy with boars and wolves, and the kind of ceremonious hunt no man will live to see again this winter, Theon Greyjoy appeared as if the sea had decided to send one of its more battered gifts inland. He bowed awkwardly because his body had forgotten some things and learned others, and none fit well together anymore. His eyes went to Daenerys and past her to Jon, and then away as if the memory of kindness was more dangerous than contempt. "I've come to fight for Winterfell," he said, and the dignity of it was in how little he asked by saying so. "You'll stand by the boy with the eyes that are too old?" Jon said. And Theon nodded and swallowed and nodded again. "The godswood suits me," Theon said. "I'm used to roots that don't forgive." "Good," Daenerys said. "They will forgive you for standing." He blinked at being spoken to as if his name were not a debt. And then he bowed again and went, and she thought of the sea. It takes back what it throws up when it can. And when it cannot, it leaves it stranded, and sometimes that stranded thing remembers how to be useful without asking for thanks. That night she dreamed under the roof, that had learned to keep warmth the way one keeps a friend one intends to see through a hard season. She dreamed of a corridor made of ice that did not melt under the foot, and reflected back a sky that could not be there. A winter sky turned red and gold, as if a summer had been pressed up against it from the other side. She dreamed of a woman with hair like winter, loosened as Lyanna's had been in stone, who put into her hand not a rose but the memory of a rose lit from within as if embers had scattered through its petals and refused to go out. She dreamed she walked, and the ice did not crack, because it understood that sometimes one must be carried, and sometimes one must carry. When she woke, there was a hatchling pressing its small head against the hollow below her ear, insisting upon her heartbeat as if it were a drum it intended to learn. "Very well," she said to the dawn. "We will be stubborn together." Word came in through a gate with snow on his shoulder, and fear making the boy's mouth a thin line. Last hearth had fallen. The men in the hall made the kind of sound people make when they mean to keep their fear from finding exits. The boy had ridden through 2 nights and a day, and his horse had fallen a mile from the walls, and been left because one does not carry a friend that far, when men need the message more than the friend needs the dignity of a slow death. They made a sign in the hall, the boy said, shaking, holding fast to the cup Davos had pressed upon him as if the heat would leak away if he let any go. A spiral of arms and legs, the Umber boy. He swallowed. The night moved in his eyes. He was the pin. "Burn it when you find it," Jon said softly, "for the boy's sake rather than because any of the men here needed instruction. If ever you find such, do not spend yourself looking long. Fire and then be on your horse." "I don't like your friends," Arya said later in the yard to Daenerys, meaning the dead and the chalk marks they left behind. "They have the manners of men who think they invented fear." "They did not," Daenerys said. "They only practice it more. We will be impolite in return." "Oh." Lyanna Mormont came then and planted herself as if she were a banner and said to Daenerys with no ceremony at all, "I want to see them." "Do you?" Daenerys asked, amused despite herself. "I'm not 6, Lyanna said, stung. "I don't ask to pet your cat. I ask to know what kind of creatures will be eating our meat and breathing our air and breaking our men's discipline when they gape at them at the wrong time." "Then troll." "Fair," Daenerys said, and led her to the chamber, and Lyanna stood as if she were attending a laying out, and watched the small heads lift, and the thin wings flare, and then subside. After a time, the girl nodded. "They are ugly," she said judicially. "Good. Beauty spoils a soldier. They will not be spoiled." And she. "You will not be spoiled either," Daenerys said. And Lyanna stared at her, and the thought that came with that stare was so great, and so old in so small a body, that the room felt suddenly large enough to hold another army. "See that you don't spoil my house," Lyanna said, and pivoted like a commander and left. The smithy learned new heat the first morning. A hatchling yawned with irritation toward the pile of coals, and gave out a breath with an edge to it. The coals livened in a stingy way, and Gendry gave the creature a look that was all respect and all calculation. "Don't give him what he wants when he asks," he said to Daenerys, as if training a prince, and she laughed and did not tell him that was exactly what she intended. Sparrows of heat appeared around Winterfell, not the priests who had made their gods cruel with their attentions, but small successes, pockets of flame, where men had worried their embers into something stubborn. There is a way that hope moves in a cold place. It goes low to the ground and does not make a show of itself lest a wind come to scold it. It runs from hand to hand, passing weight rather than light. It took that shape now. Daenerys felt it go out from her, and sometimes back again, returning to perch and be warmed for another flight. Once, in the crypt, she felt the old song under stone lose a note and replace it with another, lower, warmer. As if the place had decided to add a drum under its harp. The iron across the laps of kings held its own frost. The sword in Lyanna's hands was a cold comfort and a colder warning. She stood before the statue and thought of a life spent being a secret, and wondered whether there was any kindness in that, if the secret did not know itself until it was too late to say no. If those who come here mean to wake what has not wanted to wake. She said quietly, to no one, to name the fear, so it did not make its own name and shame them by it later. I will be here to tell them where to go back to sleep. If I cannot do that, I will be here to put them back in another way. The air did not change. Ghost's ears moved. The hush remained a hush with its particular texture. It made of her breath a visible thing, and then took it away. Missandei set her hand to the pale-edged hatchling's back one afternoon, and the creature did not pull away but leaned into it, as if she had found the seam between scale and skin that asks for touch. Grey Worm watched, the idea of later fixed in his face like a bright pin. An island, a knife, a woman alive and unafraid, and with no men at her door, insisting they had rights there. Daenerys looked at them and had a pang that was not envy and not fear, but something made when a queen knows how much the lives around her deserve more life than her needs will let them have just now. You will go to Neath, she said to them, and they both turned and she lifted her chin. When this is done, you will go. I will not keep you with me and then say that I did not know I was keeping you. If we are alive, Grey Worm said. You will be, Daenerys said, and wanted to make a vow of it, and knew better. Davos found her counting men in a book she herself had made because the numbers written by someone else take on someone else's sleep, and she needed a ledger that would not go to bed before she had finished writing in it. You are too proud to ask for help with this, he said kindly. And she smiled and pushed the book to him. And he took it up, and the numbers learned to go in straight lines under his blunt, good hands. You've done this before, she said. Kept men fed when the sea had decided eating was a luxury. Aye, he said. And women. They do it better than we do, but they have less time for boasting about it after, so men take the credit. There's barley enough for 4 days if I make the porridge thinner than I like. Bread we can put aside and pretend not to notice it going stale. The stew pots are your friends and mine, and we'll set aside the sheep that do not throw lambs this year for your creatures. It will be argued, he added. I've a tongue for arguing. We'll win. Thank you, she said simply. He grunted and made a mark. Varys came like a change in weather. The south has ears, he murmured. They will strain to hear what you do here. When the snow melts and the roads remember themselves, they will have words and swords waiting. If you live, they will worry that you have become more difficult to move than before. If I live, Daenerys said, I will have made a promise to men who count winters by the depth of their dead. The South can argue with that if it wishes. It has always believed arguments are won by men with clean boots. We will teach them to listen to mud. He let out the breath of a man delighted against his will and bowed. I have always liked mud, he said. It remembers the shape of a foot for longer than stone does. The day the third hatchling burned clean for the first time, it was not in response to any word. It was because the wind through the flue changed direction and sent smoke down, and the creature, affronted, made a small disciplined answer. A trickle of flame, a line no wider than a finger, precise as a seamstress chalk, touched a twist of kindling and made of it a virtue. The twig took the lesson and gave it to its neighbor. Daenerys put her hand close and did not flinch, She could have burned herself and smiled to have the pain. She did not. Discipline again. She would not make of this a feast for hurt. She would make of it a meal for need. All right? She told the room. The hatchlings herself. We will go slower where slowness brings us farther. From the wall a day later, a rider watched the horizon and did not blink, and when his eyes dried and demanded he give them tears, he obliged and did not move otherwise. What he saw first was a line of dark like damp on marble. What he saw next was the dark move in a way damp does not. What he saw finally when a cloud took pity and dragged itself over the sun was that the line was not a line but many lines, and they were not lines but men who had forgotten they were men, and did not breathe and did not breathe, and did not require speech to be instructed. He blew his horn, and the keep recognized the sound a body makes when it is called to fight a fever by sweating it out or dying of it. The yard filled the way a lung fills. Men ran without haste and with purpose. Women set water to warm and laid out bandages made in the hours when hands wanted occupation. The hatchlings woke and made the little upright posture of creatures who hear something the room has not yet admitted. Daenerys set her palm to the pale-edged head, and it settled, not because it had ceased to listen, but because her hand had become a thing it trusted, not to waste listening. At the Godswood, Theon stood with a bow he had learned late in life, and because he had learned it late, he respected it more. Bran looked past men and Hearttree both. The wind moved the red leaves like a hand through a child's hair. It would be here, Daenerys thought, if it broke us elsewhere. It would come through this and lay itself down where boys once hid to make their sisters jump. Keep him, she said to Theon when she went to them, and he nodded. Because a man forgiven is a weapon you can use against yourself or against your enemy. Theon seemed ready to make the better choice. At the parapet, Jon stood among men from places that had taught them speech differently, and now taught them silence the same way. He said nothing for a long time, as if words like weapons should not be picked up until one intends to use them. When he spoke, it was only to send men to their places. The line held in men's imaginations first. It would hold in the field or fail there, but for now, it held where men kept their courage. She did not go to the wall with the hatchlings. She walked to the trench line with Gendry and Davos, and a boy with his left arm in a sling who had no intention of not being useful, and she set a brazier where the wind did not think to fetch it and made of it a test. 1 breath. 2. A pause. Patience. A second breath. The oil caught the way a story catches when a room has been waiting for it. No roar. No cheap spectacle. A thread. It ran like a stitch through the fat. Men breathed. Davos smiled without showing his teeth. Good, he said. Good. It's enough to be the start. If battle were a beast with a mind, it would have smiled as it came. An hour before full dark, the snow changed. It fell with intention. The sky pressed close, as if it were trying to hear what men said into their scarves. Daenerys stood in the corridor above the yard with a hatchling under her cloak, and another on the mantle, and the third stubbornly in the curve of Missandeia's arm, like a bracelet that had decided to be alive. She listened to men counting. She listened to the quiet before the first arrows went. She listened to the stone sing underfoot, and knew it was singing for those it had to watch, and those who had watched too long. Dany, Jon said from the doorway without stepping into the room. He said the name as if he had found it in his own mouth as a boy, and only now had permission to keep it. Be ready to come when we ask. I will not be asked politely, she said, and he nodded at that. Yes, good. We do not have time for courtesy. He went. The door leaned back into its frame. The fire made its small work. The first scream came as so many first screams have come in the history of men. Not a terror, not yet, but surprise learning its duty. She did not run toward it. She straightened her shoulders and thought of a woman with winter hair and a rose that had outlasted the soil. And she thought of a girl, a long time ago, who had walked into fire because nothing else had suggested itself as a solution to a world that presumed to tell her what to do. Dracarys. She said softly, and the dark hatchling that had the frost line along its scales raised its head and made a thread of flame so neat a seamstress would have been proud to call it straight, and the wick it touched took the lesson, and the room warmed by a degree that made the difference between shivering and not. She would go below when they called. She would stand above when they required a witness. She would make of her hands a place where old stories could be taught new manners. In the crypt, the swords laid across laps lay quiet, and the rust on their hilts did not yet flake. The stone listened and stored and made a music no man would name aloud until he had lived to the morning and could decide whether to tell what he had heard. The north held itself ready to break and ready to be made whole again after. The south, far away, slept in beds that would be colder when spring came because of what was happening in this house now. Between one measured breath and the next, Daenerys felt the thing that had made her once in a desert, with nothing to eat, but resolve come back to stand at her left hand. It did not instruct. It attended. She set her palm on scaled warmth, and the small life pressed itself harder to her, as if to say, "If we are to be fierce with me." She lifted her chin and listened, and in the listening was both the seed of flame and the marrow of ice, and the music under Winterfell kept time.